The Patreon was buzzing a lot this week, and we have yet again another Transformers Slag Patreon listener question. This one comes from Cringe McCringle. And once again, if you want to be like Cringe McCringle and join the Patreon listener question of the Transformers Slag podcast, or just join the Patreon overall and just let us know that you love what we do here, help support the podcast, patreon.com/protoman. Get your name in the end credit scroll of every segment. You get to join our crazy Discord that has so much stuff going on it. It's such a great place. Probably just such a great crew of people that we got over there. A lot of people learning new stuff every single day. Also, depending on what tier you're part of, you might even get a little something in the mail, and then some, and of course, be part of the Patreon listener question tier. And Cringe McCringle wants to know, and this one's actually a little bit of a follow-up almost when I think about it, and I'll mention why. He asks here, "Hey Protoman, I got a listener question for you. My question is, what is the best way to move and or store a collection? I ask because soon I'll be off to college and I won't be around my collection. After those 4 years, I'll more than likely be moving out of my parents' house, and I'm curious how you have moved your collection." Now, the reason why I say this is almost kind of tied to it because we did a conversation and a question a couple of days ago. The title of the video, I believe, was "Does Heat Damage Your Transformer Figures?" I think that's what I called it, where we talked about how just long-term storage of Transformer product, whether it be on display or in boxes, and how heat could damage it, or sunlight or anything like that. And so after I answer this one, also listen to that one too, because that'll also kind of be tied into that, depending on where you live in the world and stuff like that. But I'll go into the two parts of it here. First, how is stuff stored? And then how is it moved? Especially the moved one, because man, did I live that one, and that was an epic journey, to say the least. For the storage one, number one, it goes into that heat thing. So if you live in an environment where it is extremely hot, listen to that video. There's so many different layers of that I covered in terms of dehumidifiers and air conditioning and moisture and all kinds of stuff like that. But otherwise, what I always say is, if your collection is on display and you have the opportunity to have it left on display during a period of time, that's usually the safest and best way to do it. Because unless you're really taking the time to wrap up every single figure, put it into a box so it doesn't get dust on top of it, and then store it in a climate-controlled area that won't lead to damage, usually you're just better off just having it on display until it's time to actually move. If you don't have that option, if your parents are like, well, while you're gone for 4 years, we want to turn this into the hot tub room or whatever, then what I do suggest is it really has to do with what's valuable and what isn't. Number one, if you already have the boxes for stuff, if you kept the boxes for it, if you could return those products to their original boxes, that's probably the safest way to store it. If it was meant for shipping and transport like that, it being in a box and not moving at all, that's probably the safest bet. If you don't have the original boxes, then you're talking about what's valuable and what isn't, and that also is going to tie into the moving part. So what I mean by that is most like post-2000s toys, Armada, Energon, Cybertron, animated, let's spin off into like Titaniums and Universe 2.0 and Prime toys and movie toys. They're pretty resilient. They're pretty tough. They could almost all be thrown into a bin. Obviously, all the accessories are going to go all over the place, and that'll be a nightmare. But if you're really, trying to keep it simple, they could handle all being thrown into a bin. If you want to put an extra layer of caution, you put all the figures on one layer of the bottom of the bin, then you take a piece of newspaper, you put it on top, and then you put a second layer of figures. That way they don't crash against each other. Another thing to worry about is where you're storing it while it's in those bins or boxes. You want to keep them somewhere that isn't crazy hot, because if you're going to be gone for 4 years, and that goes into the heat thing that I talked about in the other segment, 4 years is a lot of time for it to sit in somewhere where if it reaches, degrees of 100 Fahrenheit or above, you could be potentially damaging a lot of product. Paint could be transferring. I remember this This is some Marvel toys that I had as a kid, 90s Toy Biz Marvel toys. I had a Mr. Sinister figure, and his face was painted white. And I remember, for some reason, I can't remember why. This is Canadian Montreal weather, but for some reason or another, he was stored in this like little tackle box in the garage, and I guess it just sat there for months on end on a really brutal, hot Canadian summer. And whenever I got back to that figure, part of his face that was in contact with the side of the tackle box, the paint just melted off and just transferred to the side of and so like still to this day, I still have this Mr. Sinister figure where part of his face paint is missing just because of the heat, because it sat there for months on end as opposed to just a couple hours or something a day. So it just had all that time to broil. So you really want to avoid that because, you have some toys that have a lot of paint deco on them. And, you don't want like the paint crest of the, the top of your Hot Shot figure or whatever, just, melting off and anything. And not to mention we're talking the PVC. So that gets into the heat discussion. Again, listen to that segment. It was just 4 days ago. What I'll do is I'll also link it in the comments below so you could find it too. It's a really good discussion for the storage part. And that's another thing too. When you get into storage, where you're storing it, I would not go with the garage. Garages aren't climate controlled in general. Don't put it there. If you have to rent a storage locker, make sure that they're storage lockers that are climate controlled. There's a lot of storage locker places that you go, wow, it's really cheap. It's only $10 a month. And it literally is like a closet that's in the middle of a giant, it's in the middle of a giant yard of nothingness, and those places could get hot real fast, and stuff gets destroyed in those things because they get really, really hot. It might as well be a desert that just has a whole bunch of like porta potties in the middle of nowhere, and you're just storing your stuff in that. Hopefully it's also a place that's safe, because I have a friend, I don't want to name, but probably some people know who I'm talking about. He had his stuff put in a storage locker. The way that their storage locker system was done, for some stupid reason, you're able to pretty much enter through the roof of every storage locker because they weren't really protected. And again, there was no climate control, and people were able to break in and steal a whole bunch of his masterpiece and third-party stuff. It was pretty brutal and sucked for him. So also keep that in mind too. Make sure it's a decent environment. But again, failing all that, if you could just have it waiting at home those 4 years, you got cool parents that are willing to let you do that, that's always the best route. Just leave it how it was before, because the second you got to put it in boxes, the second you got to put it out of a proper environment, then you start playing with fire in that sense. Now when it comes to moving, so people who know, and this is like, I moved in 2010, and when I moved in 2010, got my own place, nice beautiful house, even then in 2010 had a massive collection, not just Transformers, but everything else, video games, 80s paraphernalia, 90s action figures, comic books, trading cards, just absolutely massive. I come from a family of toy collectors and collectors in general, and it was just, man, that move was epic to say the least. My father, I just want to jump ahead in this story, when we loaded, no joke, a long trailer, like a long truck, like Optimus Prime style truck, moving truck. It was filled just me. Not like, anyone else, not like a family moving or furniture, just my stuff. And I remember my dad standing there as we're loading the final thing, and he went, "Holy shit, you filled the whole thing. I don't even believe it." And I turned to him and I said, "You know what? If it would have been your stuff, it probably would have been the same thing." So, but it was a lot of stuff. But the one thing that I learned from that moving experience, and it kind of ties into the storage thing too, is when I was moving everything, because I knew it was going to be short term, it was going to be put into boxes and then opened up maybe a month later when I finally would get around to opening everything. Little did I know that, but that's a whole other story. You keep the less fragile, newer stuff. If you could just kind of like, lump it all together, it makes it easier. But the biggest and the longest process of moving was the Generation 1 stuff, specifically the more fragile 84, 85, 86, Japanese stuff. I remember, no joke, moving the G1 collection in a multiple day parts using my car. Everything else was moved with the truck, but like those good 4 or 5 shelves of just Generation 1 stuff and some Masterpiece. And again, keep in mind it was 2010, so Masterpiece, there wasn't a lot of stuff yet. It was mostly Generation 1 that was the coveted, valuable items, and third party was still in its infancy at that point. I was literally like taking, all right, we're going to take half of 1984, we're going to put them in these, styrofoam like containers and wrap them up and stuff like Jetfire that are just super fragile and could easily chip and get damaged. I was just, with kid gloves, wrapping all this stuff carefully, putting it in boxes with foam on the side, putting it in the back seat of my car, and bringing that to my house. And I was doing that every couple of days, because at the time, my job that I had as a mechanic, my original job as a mechanic, because now I have a new job as a mechanic, but back then it was close to where my parents lived, so I could go to work, do my thing, and then after work I could swing by and, all right, we're going to take Starscream Soundwave, his cassettes, Jetfire, and slowly move everything, because that stuff, I was terrified of that stuff getting damaged. I really did not want to, you spend your whole life to get that pristine, perfect Jetfire, and then you just move once and, a piece snips or cracks. And throughout the years, especially buying and selling Transformers, I see what is the common things that got broken and damaged on them just from them being stored at the bottom of a toy box, or, some parent not really caring about them and it just sitting like, in the bottom of a giant box of like parts and pieces. So I see what normally gets damaged, and like I didn't want, stuff to get stressed, damaged, stickers, paint transfer. I wanted my pristine collection to not be damaged, so that I took care with kid gloves. But the Armada toys, it was just thrown into a bin. Even most of the Beast Wars stuff, obviously outside of the few gold plastic syndrome things here and there, obviously I took care with a lot of those. But in general, most of those were fine. One of them I made a mistake. It was Rampage. He got damaged. I didn't realize how fragile he was. Even some of his clear plastic. He got messed up, so I had to replace him, and I think I still have a damaged Rampage somewhere that I've been trying to sell if anyone needs for parts at the parts parties. I'm not too sure. I have to check. It's been a while since I've dug into my inventory. But as it stands right now, you have, with those things, you got to be careful. Those are the ones where you really want to. So if you have valuable items, what I suggest with those is you kind of take it upon yourself to slowly do that transfer. And again, I had the luck and the fortune of, number one, where I was moving from wasn't going anywhere. It was my parents' house. They were going to be living there indefinitely, so they didn't mind letting me slowly transfer everything. But if you're in one of those kind of situations, then plan in advance for your more valuable products. Sometimes even if you have spare boxes of stuff from, like, let's say you had Masterpiece Transformers and you don't have those figures anymore, but you still have the boxes, sometimes the inner plastics and stuff make a good form of moving storage, where you could put some of your rarer figures inside like an MP10 box, and then you could use that as a way to move the figures, because again, those boxes were designed to handle transport to begin with, to go to the stores and make sure they don't get damaged. So they're also a good use of that. Same thing too, what I always tell people is sometimes when you're opening your packaging for your bubbles for Transformers, if you're not going to be using them, recycle them, throw them out, send them back to the earth. That was a whole other topic on the podcast. But if you know you're going to be moving, keep those bubbles, because they are little ways to store your more valuable products. And then you could dispose of the bubbles afterwards when you finally move that, G1 sideswipe, they have in pristine condition without chipped spoilers and damaged, yellow plastic and stuff like that. There's so many different things that you could do that could be done with that. And that's just coming from my collection. When Jaws D moved, it was the same thing too, where it's like, he had a lot of Generation 1 stuff that he didn't want to get damaged, his Power Ranger stuff, vintage. So there was this kid's glove method that we had to go about. Obviously, the books and everything like that isn't too much of an issue. It's all sorted and stacked, and video games are so nice and clean how they stack and everything. But it was the Generation 1 stuff. You don't want to damage your figures and stuff like that, especially ones that really weren't made in a time where collectible action figures was a thing. It was, you bought them, you played with them, they broke, and you threw them out. So a lot of that that 80s merchandise, it's a case of that. And It's the same thing when I moved. I have a very modest GI Joe collection, but it all is vintage stuff. I was very careful with that stuff too. My Ninja Turtle collection, same thing. I don't want the paint transferring on a lot of those. And let me tell you, a lot of those vintage 80s Turtles and 90s Turtles, the paint transfers off of the shells easily in the front of the shell. So there was a lot of them that I had to handle with kid gloves, and those are the ones you just got to be careful. I always say the bulk of your collection, if it's past the year 2000, that stuff is really resilient. I look at my Armada collection, my Energon and Cybertron, and a little bit of animated, because animated was just starting to come around by the time I moved. All of that stuff is still in pristine condition, and I remember just throwing it in boxes. Yeah, there might be the slight chance of stuff getting, scratched or everything, but then you just do a method where it's like you, again, put a whole bunch of figures, line a piece of newspaper, and then put a second line of figures and keep doing that just so they don't crash amongst each other too much. And then just make sure it's not jostling. We didn't hire a moving company. We got a truck. We loaded it all ourselves. I'm one person. We're not moving like, couches and beds and stuff. Yeah, I had a box spring that I bought after the fact. I think now that I think about it, the only furniture, turning my head here, the couch that I have came from my dad. And that was it. I bought a brand new bed, and then, everything else was just, I was starting a new life in a lot of ways. So I hit up IKEA, I hit up Walmart for all the cheap furniture, and the rest was history. Oh, and the computer desk, I guess. Yeah, that was something too. But, otherwise, like, you didn't need a moving company. Even when Jaws D moved, I think that there wasn't much furniture either. It's more just the stuff. You just kind of start new with new furniture and stuff like that, instead of lugging it, break your neck doing all that stuff, especially when you're putting it through, staircases that you could barely fit anything. In the case of him, when he moved to a new apartment, and Jaws D lived on the top floor of his apartment when we were moving him, and he had no elevator. So that was brutal. Woo! That was brutal. Either way. I hope that helps a little bit. I mean, it's something where when it comes to the moving, just think about what's fragile, take care of that. Everything else is pretty tough. A lot of Transformer toys are pretty tough. Obviously, since 2010, we've had way more masterpieces, and third-party stuff is the more premium items too. So, be more careful with those. If you own the original boxes, put them back in there and use that as part of the moving process. And I just hope you have a big enough truck. I mean, I don't know how big your collection is, Cringe, but I'm pretty sure if it's anything like mine, make sure you got a big enough truck. And when I suggest, when it comes to moving also with that, I mean, if you have a friend that has a nice, Econoline, hey, it's easier to throw him some money and use his vehicle. But if you don't have that opportunity, try to find a company that has Econoline vans. That usually could cover most people's collections. Obviously, I don't expect people to have the ridiculousness that I have, that needed a giant long haul trailer. But at the end of the day, if you could get an Econoline van, those typical, like the A-Team kind of van, if you will, if you could rent one of those are usually the best for most people. They're pretty simple, pretty clean, and sometimes they have really good deals with different companies too, where you could get them for like $14.99 for the day, and all you have to do is just fill up the gas tank back. So there's a lot of different options. I mean, let's put it this way, there's almost some follow-up questions that I would have in relation to your situation that I could then guide it in the right direction. This is more of a general kind of thing for most people. But when it comes to the storage part, just to like recap, I would kind of avoid most storage lockers unless you have a really, really, really professional storage locker company that has climate control and has like theft and everything like that. But a lot of these storage locker guys, and I know Goober, the famous Goober from TFCon and stuff, he stored a lot of his stuff, and those companies were sketchy. And my friend that got unfortunately robbed from his storage locker company, they were really sketchy. Like, if you saw the way that his storage locker was, anyone could just kind of hop the wall and get into the storage locker. It was like they didn't have roofs. Anyways. So I hope that helps a little bit. And again, if you want to be like Cringe, ask a question, come join the podcast, or just support the podcast. Patreon.com/Protoman. I hope you guys learned something today, and I'll see you guys really, really soon.